I feel like we're picking up pace here. So I'll go ahead and start because there is a lot to cover on this subject. And I think really our goal for this evening is, you know, for those of you who are actually sitting on this decision right now and deciding whether or not you would like to go on and get a Master of Fine Arts or not, to get as much perspective and information and grounding on the implications of the decision as possible through the really thoughtful perspectives of the panelists that we have here, who have thought about this so personally, as well as experienced it professionally. So welcome. My name is Louise Martirano. I'm the Executive Director of Redline Contemporary Art Center in Denver, Colorado. We're co-presenting this talk tonight with Workshop, our very good friend, Paddy Johnson, who is our moderator this evening. Thank you, Paddy, and also for being the co-conspirator. We chatted about this program now weeks back and are just so excited about the response. Among other things, Paddy is an online pioneer with more than 15 years experience in communications and publishing. She is the founder of Workshop, the contemporary art blog Art F City, and the co-founder of the National Publishing Project in Practical Spaces. Our wonderful panelists, which thank you all for being here tonight and making space for this really important conversation. I'll start with introducing Dexter Wimberly, is the co-founder of Art World Conference and Art World Learning, a new online platform available to schools and arts organizations that wish to foster the financial independence of their students, alumni, and artist designer communities. Also, Catherine Haggarty joins us tonight, is an artist based in Brooklyn, New York. She is the co-director of NYC Crit Club and part-time faculty at the School of Visual Arts. Thomas Evans, aka Detour, is an artist based in Denver, Colorado, specializing in large-scale public art, interactive visuals, portraiture, immersive spaces, and creative directing. Nato Thompson also joins us on the panel, is the co-founder of the Alternative Art School, author, curator, and what he describes as a cultural infrastructure builder. Charlie White joins us on the panel, is the head of the School of Art at Carnegie Mellon University. His work is as both artist and academic bridges varied mediums in critical theory, popular culture, and technology. At the end of the panel, we will have a Q&A session. We have invited colleagues of our panelists who will introduce at that time, who will help facilitate the questions that come in through the chat, and we will introduce them at that time. So again, do drop questions in the chat and we will do our best to get to all of them. So with that being said, again, thank you all for joining us tonight, for everyone who can join us on the webinar. And it is my pleasure to hand it off to Paddy now to take us into the conversation.
Well, hello, everyone. It's really nice to see everyone here, even though I'm sort of imagining your faces. My name is Paddy Johnson, and I am the founder of Workshop, an online hub that offers high-level professional training to artists. As the co-host of this event with my wonderful colleague, Louise, I'm really excited to dive into this conversation. And I wanted to sort of start out by saying that we set up this panel knowing that any proposed slaughter of the MFA program is probably going to take a little bit of time. There are institutions in place. There is a lot of money that goes into the system. I think I pulled out some research this morning that said that in 2017, the US educational system in the arts actually grew 2.7%. Now, I think that number sort of reflects a sort of general like look at the arts as opposed to the visual arts specifically. But I just wanted to kind of start this panel by acknowledging that there are now kind of a slew of problems facing institutions and the people who attend them and who work with them, you know, from debt to pay, workload, representation. And that's a lot of what, you know, I wanted to kind of start to talk about here is like, you know, if we were to, let's say, kill the MFA, like what is it exactly we would be killing, and what, you know, what are the problems that we are most urgently trying to address? So I wanted to start with Catherine Haggarty. You know, you're from a slightly younger generation than myself. When I went to art school, it was sort of assumed that eventually opportunity would come. And I'm not sure that the generation that is now in art school is certainly feeling that way. And maybe your generation feels that way too. Can you talk a little bit about the problems that students face that you work with, both in your career as an adjunct and at NYC Crit Club, and what you think is needed that MFAs don't necessarily answer?
Thanks,
or
Patty.
that they do?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I will say that my experience both as an adjunct and undergraduate and also directing the New York City Crit Club, which works with artists post-VFA and post-MFA, is unique in that I see all the problems that artists have from a very, vulnerable place where they're trying to figure out what to do after undergrad, and then simply they've gotten a graduate degree from Pratt or Yale or what have you, and they don't know what to do after. They're 10 years out of their MFA, they don't have the infrastructure, they don't maybe have the social networks they thought they would have had. And so the thing I see the most is simply community and connection. That's something that everyone wants and doesn't know exactly how to get it. Typically an MFA serves so many purposes, but, and I do think the MFA is really important still, I just think it needs a lot of changes. One of the things that an MFA gives people of all ages is essentially time off from working and a break to focus on their work. And that's really hard to get if you don't have financial independence or some kind of luxury like that. So one of the problems I see is that artists don't know how to find the balance between working full-time, paying their rent, making art, finding community. And in doing so, there's this stress about the professionalization of the art world, right? So there's this idea of how do I stack my CV? How do I look like I'm very busy? And then how does my portfolio reflect all of that? And so a lot of artists want to go to graduate school because they think it will launch them to the next stage. And I always try to very much remind them that it is an important part of your life if you get to go, but it's really just the beginning and that there's so much more after. So I'm really interested in the infrastructure of post-school, actually fundamentally within New York City Crit Club, but also just within. And so I think what MFAs could do maybe perhaps a little bit better. I went 10 years ago to a great school. I went to Rutgers MFA. But what I wish I knew a little more was the practical issues of art, just the day-to-day, how to apply to things, how to, sort of get my foot in the door. I learned over 10 years of errors and a lot of hard work and grit. But I do wish there was a little bit more practical ideology. And, maybe there is now. I just didn't get that then. I got a good experience. But the thing I see with hundreds of people a semester is, how do I get there? And what is there? And there's no concrete idea for artists when they leave elite schools or state schools of what to do. And that's the biggest gap of knowledge. I don't care if you're 20 or 40 or 60. I work with all ages and it's the same problem. How do I get somewhere? So.
And do you all feel like that the MFA provides that path or can provide that path? Like Charlie, you work at a place that, would you say that that's one of the things you promise?
I think in general, I would say that programs differ so much one to the next. So I think, if we look at where we are as a program, I think that there's an inordinate focus on making sure that students understand funding, understand residencies, understand all of the avenues that they could use in order to be supported. We also have a number of students who've come from having a history where they've already done residencies. So I think currently that wasn't in any way on the radar, and you and I are in a similar time zone in our life at all when I was in school. And then I've dealt with graduate programs for the last 17 years, and I would say that that is something that has been only on the uptick, understanding those things. But an essential shift being, which we'll talk more and more about, is the funding of the program itself. So, right out of the gate, my position is that a graduate education should be fully funded or as close to fully funded at this point as it can be. That wasn't always the case, and maybe didn't always have to be the case, but at this stage, graduate school for artists, the MFA should be fully funded, if it can be, or a program should be doing everything it can to make funding the smallest hurdle it can be for its students.
And to just throw this out to the panel in general, why do you think it's so important that now, as opposed to 20 years ago, that we make these programs free?
Well, I'll just chime in. Just to try to get to the heart of my thought about your question. I think that the world has changed a lot in 20 years. I think that people's perceptions of what an art career looks like has changed a lot in the past 20 years. I think the cost of living, just speaking more practically, has also changed a lot in the past 20 years. So we just break it down to something as simple as, what does it take for someone to survive in a city in terms of paying their bills? That's changed a lot in the past 20 years. So I think all of these pressures, these economic pressures, are contributing to how people are reevaluating the value of the things that they've put their money into, and trying to sort of figure out their way forward through this sort of minefield of debt and sort of fiscal issues. I mean, again, I know that there are a lot more issues to discuss when one is talking about an MFA, but my particular area of focus is the economic impact that any decision an individual makes has on their life. So I just think my answer to your question in terms of the past 20 years, rent is higher, healthcare is higher, I think it's more difficult to do a lot of the things that an artist may want to achieve. And so those things are contributing to, I think, the difference in how people perceive things.
Dexter, I wanted to talk to you, to ask you this specifically, because you had said in earlier conversations that we've had that you take a very pragmatic approach to all your projects, and that one of the things that you think is sort of difficult for artists is the way we kind of get trained in art school to not talk about financial issues. That's not and I think that it might even extend beyond art school. There's a kind of culture where we're not supposed to we're not supposed to be good at these things. And I wondered where you think that comes from.
I think it's rooted in sort of historical sort of racial politics, sort of gender politics, I think plays a role in that. Just, anecdotally, I would say that, really rich people talk about money all the time, and really poor people talk about money all the time, and the people in the middle are sort of ashamed to talk about money. That's been my funny observation. So, a bunch of hedge fund guys sitting around, they're going to love to talk about it, and people that feel like they don't have anything will talk about the fact that it seems like everyone else has everything. But I think that, the conversation about money as it relates to education is something that parents owe it to their teenagers to have that conversation with them as they're sort of considered making these kinds of decisions. I think that sort of a lack of clarity around how the decisions that you make for your higher education, how those decisions stick with you for decades, a lack of clarity around that, I think it's also driving a lot of people's decision making. I think that, and we talked about this a little earlier, kind of like, like off camera, this idea that a lot of people are pursuing degrees because they think that that stamp of approval gives them immediate access to something. And in some regards it does, is access to a network, is access, and hopefully, the training and the education you get within the context of the program that you're in is also valuable. But I think a lot of these decisions are not being made with a clear understanding of what does it mean on the other side of that, right? And I think that historically, the conversation around money is not something that people want to have because they think it makes them look as if they're not as committed to art, as committed to culture. But I think those things are completely tied with one another, I believe.
Thomas, I think you had something that you were going to say, but your mic was muted. Could you, would you like to respond?
I totally forgot the question that was asked that you pointed out earlier before, but definitely wanted to sort of chime in on the idea of like the idea that artists go into the MFA program thinking, you're going to get the stamp of approval, like Dexter said, and then actually come out and sort of figure out, that they have this ladder or these different steps to go through to make that success that they want to have in the art world. But, it's not like you're an engineer coming out where it's like, how you kind of world, or a doctor or a lawyer where you have sort of this ladder. Whereas an artist it's so ambiguous in terms of how you want to sort of fit into the world, because we're all supposed to be really unique. And to be unique, you have to sort of figure out your own way. So you have to sort of deconstruct this ladder and try to figure out how do I sort of construct my own ladder and figure out how to go up to where, I think success is. And a lot of artists get outside of that MFA program, which are ones that I talk to, and they sometimes really don't know how to fit, especially as the world change. A lot of times these institutions don't change as fast. So they're not up to date when it comes to the technology, the way we sort of interact with galleries, the way even galleries are changing today. So a lot of times it's really difficult to hear some of the stories of how some of these students are so sort of lost afterwards. And, it's something where I'm trying to sort of take it upon myself to actually help a lot of these artists sort of figure out how to sort of do these alternative routes and figure out how to get to where they want to be. Because for me, being a self-taught artist, I didn't go to, the sort of the MFA program or the BFA. It was sort of the business school for me. And then basically trying to figure out life, and then trying to figure out, okay, I want to be an artist. Okay, how do I do that? And figuring out, okay, what are some of the steps? who do I need to talk to? So, figuring out, okay, residencies are something that I really need to get into. How do I sort of get into, the Redline residency, which is sort of why we're here today? How do I get into this museum? How do I get into this gallery? How do I talk to these individuals? And I think that is something that has really helped me out, not knowing it at the beginning. Having to learn that on the fly helps me adapt to the world as the world sort of changes around us. So I'm able to better adapt as the world changes and figure out, okay, this is how I relate to the world in this art space, in this art industry, and this is how I relate as it changes as well.
Nato, thank you, Thomas. Nato, I wanted to sort of switch to you at this point, because I feel like you have occupied kind of an interesting position as a quote unquote gatekeeper. You have this like really like high profile presence as a curator who's been at Creative Time and the like Philadelphia Contemporary, and like now you're doing the alternative school, and I'm just wondering, like, what does gatekeeping like look like for you, and like are you able to like break some of that down a little bit with the new project that you're working on?
Appreciate that. Two things I'll say. First of all, thanks for having me here. I had a problem with the Kill the MFA language, but bear with me. I just feel like we've gone through 4 years of a president's like to kill everything. And I feel like the world of killing and destroying, you find peculiar allies when you want to destroy the world. And the art world certainly loves destroying. And there's not much left to build from. I think it's time to build other worlds, to go to what Thomas said, to build your own ladder. I think it's a great opportunity in the art world to build other infrastructures, to build alliances, to build allies. You know, when people say they get out of the MFA and there's no jobs for them, well, don't blame your MFA entirely, blame the entire field of white supremacy and capitalism as well. You know, it's hard to prepare yourself for a world that is devoid of compassion or support. And I think rather than critiquing the structures that exist, you know, this is a time, I think this year, some sort of divine power put a pause on the world with much tragedy, but said, this is a chance to build other worlds together. And I think we can all do that. And so the Alternative Art School, which we've founded, is an opportunity to just close the distance between artist and instructor, to not fight with thousands of people, but in fact be in intimate spaces of 12 to 14 and learn from each other around the world. We have students from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, 2 in Bogota, 2 in Melbourne, 1 in Bangalore, 3 in Bangkok, 1 in Accra, Ghana. And we are fellow artists and thinkers and people trying to build an infrastructure with the radical idea of building it on what I call middle-class money. We don't need to apply for a grant. The Black Panthers didn't get a grant to start the revolution, but they did need money. And I do think, to go to Dexter and everyone here, and Charlie and everyone, I think of ourselves as allies. I don't know how long in the art world we're going to sit by and let the Swiss run it with their art auctions, or there's billions of dollars while not a single artist that you know makes any money. While you walk around New York, but not a single person you know owns a building, but you seem to know a lot of people. Well, I don't think the time is to critique, the time is to build. And, you know, if the MFA, I got an MA from the School of Art Institute of Chicago under the deanship of Carol Becker, who now runs Columbia. And I got to tell you, I studied with Greg Chalette, and I studied with Greg Bordowitz, and I studied with some amazing people that gave me no practical job skills, but gave me an analysis of capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy. And I think that those skill sets, while not necessarily able to churn in for a job, did give me some skill sets in terms of building a community. And I think that that is something that we're all in need of, is answers and solutions and building. And, you know, the Alternative Art School is based on a kind of economic model of DC hardcore, which is where kids bought punk albums for $5, but they believed in the music and the labels. And actually, music industry has built this a lot in terms of supporting the aesthetic and political economies of people you believed in. And the arts can do that. And I'm not going to tear down some MFAs. I mean, Lord knows every political artist I know has got a job with the school. And I don't want to get them, I don't want to make them unemployed right just yet. I mean, I could go on. Sharon Hayes, Waleed Rod, most of the people that's artists in Occupy Wall Street, they all got a gig somewhere. So I'm not ready to tear it all down. But we all know that we're all participating in some messed up structures. And I think we can all work together to build new ones.
Paddy, can I just, because on what Nato said, and back to your original question, tying it to what Nato said, why then were we all paying, and why now should we not pay? Especially, you know, speaking to those of us in the room who all went. I went to Art Center. I went there to study with Stephen Prina. He had become a kind of national spectacle when he created the films of Keanu Reeves' class, which was then outed by Rush Limbaugh, who said that the left was, you know, completely fraudulent, and that drove me there. And I had no problem at that moment in my life saying, you know, this is an experiment in education, and I wasn't thinking about the money, and I went through the process, and it was transformative. Why the generation that I worked with at USC decided that it was time for us to make the program free, why we made it fully funded using the university's own language to help us fund it, and why we all left when they defunded it, was because we all were in debt. I consolidated my debt. I'm in a very lucky position having my position, but but I consolidated my debt because I was so afraid of my costs that I'm still going to pay it off for 30 years because it's consolidated. The reason why we should be free with programs or make programs affordable or as affordable as possible is because, to Nato's point, every one of us paid for graduate school. Of most of the gatekeepers who are running programs or populating programs all went at a time when we paid a premium, and we know the long-term effects of that. And for that reason, and because it's no longer an experiment, and in some cases it's turned into a factory, we shouldn't continue to do what was done in the past. We could make a program that's equivalent to a physics program or an engineering program or any other science program that always naturally fully funds its terminal degree students.
Yeah. May I say one thing? I do agree with the idea of fully funding, if that's possible for any institution, state or private. And I think there are so many great MFA programs that are fully funded and some that are partially funded or honestly not that expensive. You know, and I think the idea that Nato said, which I appreciate, is the idea of building is the most important conversation. I think the MFA infrastructure is probably largely tied to powers, not to diminish it, beyond us, where I don't know how to change that infrastructure. I'm not in that infrastructure. But the thing I do know is that there's a large gap of need of connection for artists post BFA and post MFA. And that is something that is able to be built. And artists essentially have agency and have shown this for 2 decades easily within the Artists Run network. Galleries like Regina Rex in New York City, of course, you know, over a decade ago started, Ortega y Gasset and such, where artists essentially saw gaps in what was possible to exhibit and built it. And I think, you know, the Alternative Arts School, NYC Crit Club, and many other like kind of non-institution programs really want the professionalism and the sort of quality that I got in grad school. I loved my grad school experience. I want people to have similar, but I know not everyone can take off 2 years of work or 3 years or part-time. And so I think that idea of the gap of the longevity of the artists is really the most interesting. And that is a huge room to grow in terms of what can we offer the art world after school, like kind of a post-school idea of how to get forward. Sorry.
Can I just jump into, you know, something, we've only been 2 quarters in our school, and something that blew my mind was our students, our artists, who are predominantly my age, between the ages of 40 and 65, leaning heavily female. And our school is entirely on the internet. Something that blew my mind, because Lord knows COVID has been a 1-year-long boot camp into the internet, is that not only does the internet connect cities to cities across the world, but they also connect the interior of the home to the exterior world. And that is a gendered space, so we are heavily female. And our students, quote unquote, are artists who are locked out of the art world for a variety of patriarchal reasons. And it is profound the ways in which we have artists attending that have kids running around the background, who have a set of complex lives that are able to be met in this platform. And I, you know, as much as I used to joke that the art world was that thing you did after you were on the internet, but there is some amazing things that happen with connecting domestic space with a space of cultural production. Right. And I'm excited to have Jep come on because we've had 4 students from Thailand, one who's a filmmaker, and there is, just to say one other thing, which is people say community, and when they say community, they often mean places, people that don't typically travel. Well, can we think about the profound capacity of people that don't travel to meet with diasporic communities in cultural productive spaces at affordable rates? We are talking about a profound pedagogical experiment, the likes of which Paulo Freire had never even imagined. And it's not just about MFAs, it's about creating meaningful culture in a world where most countries are all about themselves. Saudi Arabia is into Saudi Arabia, Russia's into Russia, China's into China, US is into US, Brazil's into Brazil. It's about the artists all reaching out and making a different world that isn't negotiated by art fairs, art sales, and luxury economies.
Just out of curiosity, does anybody happen to know what the like average, what the gender of the average MFA student is? Because I thought like MFAs were typically more heavily attended by female students. At least that was the way it was when I went to grad school.
You know, I don't know the specific statistics, but the last statistics I can sort of like recall is that it would skew more toward, you know, female or women than men. But we also know that ethnicity wise, it also skews more than white than Black or Latino, right? And you know, and I think it's important to address those issues as well. I mean, one thing you said, Nato, that I also want to talk a bit about is this idea of people feeling like they're excluded from the art world, because I spent a lot of time thinking about just what is the art world, you know, and I have these sort of moments where I think I know what it is, and then these moments where I'm like, clearly my idea of what the art world is very different from what other people's idea of what the art world is. You know, so in one regard, you know, when someone says they want to be a success in the art world, you know, I could have a knee-jerk reaction to think I know what they mean by that statement, but then I have to really ask them what they mean. Because if they mean being with a, you know, quote unquote blue chip gallery, that's one, you know, route. If they mean just being able to sustain themselves on their career with their, you know, with their work and, you know, and make a career out of that, that's another one. But there are so many other ways. And I love what you referenced about, you know, the fact that there are these like local communities and local economies that can thrive and flourish and don't need to necessarily be attached to this sort of like traditional kind of cliche version of what we think of as the art world. But back to my earlier point about sort of the makeup of MFAs, the reason I wanted to bring that up is that I think a lot of my experience has been that, you know, it's a bit of a luxury to be able to, you know, take that time, right? To be able to have that time. You mentioned it, Catherine, right? And a lot of those luxuries come from being in a different socioeconomic position historically with family. And you know, and I'm quite sure that there are many people who might not know a lot about, you know, any version of the art world that we hear this conversation and sort of like, you know, roll their eyes and go, well, you know, you go to college so you can get a job, right? And if you make a decision to go down a career path that is not sort of guaranteeing you any work, then you get what you get kind of scenario. I don't agree with that, but I know that there are a lot of people that think that way. And so, you know, I think what I want to try to unpack a little bit here is, you know, sort of what is the, you know, sort of what is the reason? What is the outlook? We're talking about the possibility of killing the MFA, but, you know, I'd just love to hear randomly from anyone on the panel, like what is the promise? Like, you know, what is the promise? I mean, I know my mom used to tell me, you know, before I you know, even got to high school, it's like you get an education because on the other side of that is something. But
well,
what is the promise?
The conversation at large about the liberal arts and that investment. When people say they don't get the return on their investment, that's a statement that should just be dropped from the dialogue. In no way, shape, or form can anyone expect that a $44,000 a year MFA program is going to be a monetary return on their investment the following year. So that's not the right way to frame it. Not saying you did that, other people do. That's fair. That's a good.
I'm playing a bit of devil's advocate here.
Yeah, it's just devil's advocate. I'm not actually interested in killing the MFA. I think the MFA is so important. I just think that there has to be a conversation about life after and life before, and the possibilities of the MFA may be in some capacity, if it's possible, just including some practical things that I don't feel like I have gotten. I've worked with people who've recently graduated from great MFAs in the tri-state area that cannot write a legible artist statement or don't know how to apply to something, and that's all fine and good. But I think that there's something missing there with that comprehensive $90,000 a year education or $40,000 or free education. So, but ultimately, I think that idea of return on investment should be lost. I also want to say one thing about ageism. It's a real thing in the art world. When I went to Rutgers MFA 11 years ago, there were a few people in my program that were 40 and 50. And I remember very specifically there being critiques on their value being there because they were not going to be art stars. And one thing I'm really proud about with Hillary that I run the Crit Club with is that I work with artists from 20 to 75, and they all have a really amazing, exciting dialogue. And so when we're talking about gatekeepers, the gatekeepers are this, like, who's the next big thing? When we look at the resume to accept applicants to a school or a panel or a show, we look at their pedigree. And that's the educational classism that I do think needs to be challenged. I work with people that are 70 that have the most amazing life experience, that offer a great critique with a 23-year-old kid from SUNY Purchase BFA who's also amazing. And that dialogue can coexist. But in my experience, which is obviously one experience, I didn't find that quite very welcoming. And I think the art world is ageist and it's opportunistic. And so alternative models offer a way that people can have opportunities to have a dialogue. You can be a mother with 3 people in the middle of the country, like Melissa Vogel Woods, who's a professor in the Midwest, is talking about a fantastic artist in the chat. And I think those are the models that are the most engaging and long-term lasting. So I'm not anti-MFA. I loved my MFA. I write 30 recommendations every quarter for MFA students. I'm a fan of it. I just wish it cost less money because I don't want them to pay the $500 a month they'll have to pay after. That's it.
I agree with you. I agree with you fully. And the one thing I will add, though, I don't think it's okay that someone after that much education cannot write an artist statement. That I will say. We'll throw that in there. I think that some of these skills relating to like the practical aspects of an artist's career need to be rolled into what is being taught and what people learn.
So is it more of a don't kill the MFA, but break it down, reinvent it to where it addresses the needs of what we're going through today and how we can sort of make sure that as artists sort of go through whatever the MFA program is in the future, that they're better prepared to sort of be able to adapt like a chameleon to the changing technology, the changing sort of world. One of the things that I've been talking to a lot of artists about have been sort of the digital world, the VR, AR world, crypto art. I mean, there's so many different aspects of, you know, what you can do in the art world nowadays. It seems like, you know, the MFA can't really hold all that knowledge, and really it's sort of democratized to where now, you know, you can go to any part of the corner of the world and figure out how to sort of create what you really want to. So for me, it's been sort of talking to a lot of the artists who come through the MFA program and saying, hey, what has been sort of what are they lacking, and sort of what have you really wanted to do? So like the artist statement, I get that question all the time from people who've been through those programs. They don't know how to write an artist statement. I talk to a lot of artists who've been through like RISD and SCAD, and one of the things that they really love is like the community. But you know, you can also, if you work hard enough, build that same community outside of that MFA program. So I mean, it seems like you can really get a lot of the things from that MFA program that you really want to, and sometimes other places. So, you know, it may not be killing the MFA program, but how to adapt to include a lot of the things that, you know, that a lot of, that you really want and will help you adapt afterwards. So for me, it's really interesting being a full-time artist, you know, not having that sort of background and being able to sort of claw my way, you know, to be somewhat successful in my own right and figure out how to sort of make it as the sort of the artist. And for me, it was all about just living life and experiencing life. And I think that's one thing that I think a lot of the artists that might still connect. I think a lot of the artists that I've talked to sometimes don't really have that real life experience. And I think we sort of talked about that earlier. It's like, you know, it's not something you want to go into right after your BFA. It's like living life a little bit and then getting back into the MFA program. So for me, it's been something to where, how do I sort of figure out how I can, you know, let me rephrase that. It's I think it's really, like I said earlier, kind of blabbing right earlier, how we break it down and sort of recreate the MFA into where, you know, I'm able to sort of succeed like I want to based off of what I think success is, and sort of not have that debt sort of I'm tied to, because, you know, like I said, everything you can get into in an MFA, you can sort of recreate that in some other places as well. It just takes a lot longer. It takes a lot more work, but you can do that.
And I know we're getting tight on time here, but one thing I just wanted to add is, you know, just speaking directly to the topic, I don't think it's time to kill an MFA. I think it's time to be open to new models. I think it's time to be open to evaluating what works and what doesn't work in existing models. So much about our lives has been regulated by tradition. And I just think that it's healthy to be willing to confront whether or not certain infrastructures still work when everything else about the world is changing. And you could say that about so many other things, whether it's, you know, higher ed or mortgages or health insurance and so many other aspects that can control our, you know, sort of economic lives. we have to ask ourselves what's working and what's not working.
You know, one of the things that I wanted to just sort of lob out there to the panelists is that I feel like sort of mythologies have come up a little bit on this conversation. I think partially Dexter to do with the ideas of like, you know, what kinds of skills artists are supposed to have and which ones they aren't. And I feel like this is something where like new models perhaps are very useful. Like there does seem to be the expectation like that the artist should be able to do a lot of different things that maybe the artists cannot always do on their own. Like this sort of I feel like there's kind of a crucible of the individual that sometimes can be a real hindrance to just getting things done, where, you know, an artist is expected to say, do an artist statement on their own when institutions have like entire staff built around like crafting the perfect press release and the perfect like mission statement on all of that. But that also, I feel like, can translate into the world of like adjuncts and faculty, where faculty artists are expected to teach classes that they don't necessarily, like they weren't taught themselves. And now they're like, okay, I guess I'm a professional like practice expert, or okay, I guess I'm this now. And I just wonder whether like our expectations on what we all can be are maybe a little outsized for what a single, for the amount of knowledge a single individual can have at one time.
Well, I mean, I think it's societal. I don't think it's just artists. Yeah. And I'm all for like, you know, pushing the bird off the branch, you know, like you got to just like try to like live in the world. Look, I mean, every day you go to the mailbox, you're getting solicited for things like, oh, do you want to open this credit card? Or you know, if someone says to you, you know, there's a job opportunity, then the expectation is that you'll have a resume. These are like real world things. And I just think that everyone, whether you're an artist, aspiring artist, or you're in some other track, you know, in your education, everyone needs those skills. I mean, you need to know about like these kind of concrete aspects of life. And I think that's sort of outside of this conversation in some regards, because it's like a broader issue. These are things that people need to know how to do.
But it is a bit of a riddle, which is we complain about the art world and then we train people to focus on the art world we hate. I mean, you know, listen, there's no there when it comes to the art world. Everyone's worried about an artist statement, throw it out the window. Build community, find spaces you care about. You know, people, you know, like during Trump, you know, the friend that complained about Trump so much you want to go crazy? The last thing we need to do is complain about the art world we hate. It doesn't matter. We need to focus on the art world we care about because they need your support. And quite frankly, you're more likely to get a show at the place you love than you are at the place you hate. So stop trying to get in the place you hate. And the art world has always suffered from that Groucho Marx saying, which is, I'll never be a part of a club that would have me as a member. New York City is an aberration to the reality of what the art world is, which is 2 commercial galleries that you can't get a show at in your town, where all the artists are annoyed because they can't get grants. That's the world. That's the world.
Are you saying that's New York?
And that's just, you know, rather than thinking New York City is the rule, it's the exception. And what we need to do is your town that doesn't have a commercial gallery, it does have a space you love, and we can write about them and do critiques about it, and we can support it. And the only reason Jerry Saltz and all these art critics write about these commercial spaces is because the only place people can get paid. And the New York Times is always all the news that's fit to print within a subway ride of the New York Times.
Right.
Let's give it a break. The real world is exactly how we think it is, which is struggling spaces that we care about that don't get the attention, but we know it's worthwhile. And no, you don't get the commercial love, but it's the reality. And we got to support each other in it and stop wasting time on this art world that none of us enjoy. And none of it's even interesting.
I think just one thing, because I do agree that that New York City is absolutely not the art world, and that it is kind of like its pocket, you know, section of the world. There's like probably 100 amazing artist friend galleries, blogs that have started because of New York, because of that kind of scrappiness of people trying to set themselves afoot. There are tons of opportunities that I think people really try to set themselves apart in a really difficult and scrappy competitive situation of New York. And I also just want to say that, you know, the idea that we all have to professionalize the practice is not the goal. I don't mean that by any means. I just mean to say that I feel an obligation, if I'm a mentor or a critic to any artist at any level, if they want to know something, I can help them in some way. And I do think that if that's part of their goal and their success path, and that's fine. I'm about the work first, and I think that we all are, and I think we all understand that. But you know, to be in the game of opportunities, if you don't go to the fancy art schools, the top tier art schools, you might not have those networks, and you might not get into that application pool if you don't know how to at least just put things together in a comprehensive order, like maybe applying to your school or other schools or programs. And so I just think like best practices is a good way to look at it. I don't think it's about the idea that they all have to be academics or writing novels about their work. And Paddy makes a great point. Everyone needs an editor and a buddy, and it doesn't have to be an MFA. It could be a friend or someone you text or whatever. So I don't think it has to be so polarized in that respect. I think artists are asked to do too much, but artists do a lot because of their agency, be it curating, writing, critiques, online platforms, and the agency of artists is unparalleled. I think it's so inspiring, and I think it's actually a testament to breaking down the model that none of us like. I'm not going to Zwerner tomorrow. I know that. It's fact. It's fine. I'm thrilled no matter what, because I love the art world. And the art world is not just like Jerry Saltz and Gagosian, and those things are fine for some people, but that's not the whole world.
I would just add, I feel that it's really at this point down to a very small, if not no, programs operate in the way, graduate programs operate in the way that they did 10 years ago. I think that they have pivoted in many ways away from aspects of New York, not all programs. And it's definitely not in defense of programs, but somewhere between kind of Nato and Catherine's comments. If a program is going to exist, and it doesn't have to exist, so no individual has to get an MFA, and it's not a necessity to get an MFA by any means, but if it's going to exist, its funding, its pedagogy, its structure, how many students it allows in, what its faculty structure is, that should be a glass door at this point. That should be something that's extremely clear to a student who's applying. Who they're going to work with, what type of physical environment they're going to be in when they're working. That should also be made very clear to students. So, you know, I'm taking a very specific part of this conversation as we kind of move around and looking at my role in relationship to a program in the concrete sense. Those things I think are essential. When you see programs that let in 200 students, the equity of those students is going somewhere. If a school is funding itself through graduate students, that's a problem. If a school is cycling an inordinate number of faculty, part-time faculty through its studios that don't allow you enough time and relation to build a dynamic with them, that's a problem. So I think that, you know, one part of the student or artist who's looking at a graduate program today, one piece of information I would kind of share is that the program really needs to be scrutinized closely.
Hey, Charlie, can I ask you something? It's kind of fun. So you know how so much of the art world, Ford Foundation, all these foundations, all these boards, even the endowment from Carnegie, just to think about it, it's all wealth management, right? It's all like money that's put into a hedge fund that is redistributed to support our lives. And no offense, I'm all for, you know, look, the art world always juggles somewhat for the king. So I got no problem. I'm Machiavellian, so I'm more Machiavellian than Marx. But at the end of the day, you know, I always joke, the art world is not even capitalist, never got that far. It's literally feudalist. It is Medici period in its bones, and it never changed. But I think of Medici period as foundations, as endowments, as wealth management of the luxury class that we are always at the behest of. And the arts forever has been a kind of vestige of this luxury economy. At what point And I appreciate what you're saying about fully funded grad programs. We understand that that means Harvards and Yales and big schools with big endowments. So I'm just asking you, where do we, how do we deal with that kind of complexity as a political project?
Okay, just really quickly, if a university can have an engineering or science program that they fund, if they can do it for artists, but they don't. Why don't they? If you have a small program that doesn't let in 200 students, you probably could let in 15 students and fully fund them. Is that a problem? I mean, these are things people would have to really take apart and think and ask themselves those questions. What NATO is getting at is for every $1 million that a university holds, it sheds $50,000 a year in liquidity. I am happy to do the breakdown of how schools fund themselves because no one is willing to do it and explain what it is. Our school puts away $500,000 of equity that we do not pull from students in trade for letting them in for 2/3 off of their tuition at the outset. Any school could fundamentally do that if they can figure out their structure. I know this is terribly bland, but it's the core discussion no one's willing to have about why students pay to go to school. And you don't need to do it at the terminal. I won't speak to undergraduate. It's unfortunate, but at least an undergraduate gets the entire university or the entire college to move across. Graduate students don't operate in that way and should be treated differently because they're a resource and a value to the intellectual center of the faculty and the school. So again, I look at the sciences and just argue, why are the sciences funded?
I totally agree with you in that regard. Like,
Charles, is your question why? Is that a rhetorical question? Because I think you have an answer.
What?
Charlie, I feel like when you say why are the sciences funded and not the artists, I feel like at the heart of that, like I feel like you actually have
priority.
An answer.
It's priority.
It's also
priority.
It's literally defense contracts.
People bring in money towards those areas. It's because they can build other, empires within academia based on that liquidity. They won't do it for the arts. What is Yale's drama collapsed? I mean, if you can look inside of very, very wealthy universities that allow MFA programs in writing. I mean, we're not the worst off. Writing, poetry, and drama and dramaturgy has been collapsing in even wealthy universities because they don't have funding.
Well, and I know that a lot of big universities are hurting right now because not enough surgeries are happening and they're propped up by their hospitals because of the COVID epidemic. There's not as much money coming in through the healthcare industry. And they are these, and then, like I saw a lecture by Andrew Ross about NYU, this behemoth in New York City that gobbles up real estate like God knows what. And everyone says universities are like, are capitalist corporations. And he said, it's ridiculous. You can't call it a corporation. No corporation would be this bloated at the top. They don't run that way. But it is important to go to the MFA. I think we have to extend it to the crisis of not just education, because I'm sympathetic to a lot of good teachers and a lot of good people that understand that there is a critique of the structure of powers that are embedded in these that will not exist if we become a job training program across the planet. But it is something that has to be tackled, and the student debt issue is certainly a tip of the iceberg of these things.
I also think we should have an honest conversation about what is affordable. I mean, the idea of what it means to be a living, working artist in any area of the United States, let's just say, and take a class, continuing ed, professional or not, is also a real issue. I mean, I think it's really difficult for people to work and take a class, and whatever that means in terms of their life art sort of experience, which I just want to point out, Lisa mentioned in the chat, Lisa Curran Davis, who's a professor at Hunter and a great artist, that the conversation is obviously about professional and like the sort of institutional critique. Obviously, art is a life fundamentally always first and foremost. It's a marathon. I don't care what pedigree you get or don't get. I studied psychology. I went to state schools. I don't have art pedigree. I also believe that like us as quote unquote gatekeepers to giving advice to people of all ages and world, geography, is that it is a life. It is not about that return on investment, that the investment are the conversations, the investment are the experiences, the trips, the arts, and all of that. And so that is mentioned in MFA programs. That's a big part of why that's a valuable structure. But the gap of what's needed is what to do after, what to do before, and then what to do if you don't want to go to school. That's the biggest gap. That's a gap that needs to be filled, and I think is being filled slowly and surely. And I, for one, am glad that we offer that at an incredibly, really low rate, if not barely free, in New York and beyond. And for 5 years was on the ground, not Zoom. And now Zoom has obviously enabled us to talk to people from all over, and also talked about the issue of ability to attend classes, obviously the issue of physical ability to walk to classes. That sort of issue of access is also a huge conversation in the arts. Not everyone can walk somewhere, so having Zoom is really helpful, as Nato mentioned earlier. For that,
I can't help but think that perhaps as we think about this conversation about access and who has it and who doesn't, and the alternatives that we all one of the reasons I think all of you are here is because you are builders, you are building alternatives. But I think one of the things I'm wondering about through all this is whether we need to also be thinking about and maybe this is a little bit beyond what we as individuals can do, but whether there are whether this is really also a policy problem, right? That if universities cannot fully fund, they can only fund small pools of people, and it's not sort of commercially advantageous for them, even though I guess they're nonprofits in a certain kind of way, and it's not commercially viable viable for them as a business, that seems to me where more government funding would be useful, right? Because we have to find ways to make education more accessible to everyone, and that seems like a very big social problem that needs to be tackled. Sorry.
I mean, I think that's absolutely true, and I know we're probably moving to Q&A, but I often think that when we start talking about things being free or very, very inexpensive and completely merit-based, I would see a little asterisk there, because I know that historically this country has always sort of found a way to shut certain groups out, be it because of gender or age or geography, even for that matter, even though we say it's just merit-based. So I think there would still need to be some rails, some safeguards in there to make sure that access is still available, because just making something free or low cost actually isn't the solution.
So I wanted to take, thank you, Dexter. I wanted to take this time at this point to move us over to the Q&A section. We have two additional people here who are going to help us out with that. Could you all, I guess, turn your videos on, and we will move into that section.
So I want to introduce Heather Bandari is the co-founder of Art World Conference, an independent curator and a co-founder of the Remix, and also teaches at Brown University. But as with everyone, please also share about yourself beyond the one-liners I asked you to deliver to me, so thank you. And then Jeb Gritia, please correct my pronunciation also. It founded arts organization Project 304 and is currently the artistic director of the Jim Thompson Arts Center in Bangkok. So welcome our special guest to the Q&A. I don't know if you particularly saw the chat thread and if there was a particular question that you latched onto that you want to offer up to kind of answer yourself or to the other panelists.
I guess when I was listening, by the way, great conversation, everyone. I really enjoyed listening, and I sort of lost track of the fact that I was coming in and had to speak in a little bit. So it was really, really engaging. There were so many things that I was thinking about while I was listening. And one that sort of started to roll around my head was that maybe do we need to, I don't think we need to kill the MFA. I think we might need to kill this narrative that people have swallowed when they're going to get the MFA. This narrative of like a single solitary like genius going to get this elite education where there's this amazing network, and then you leave and you get a gallery, you get gallery representation, and then you make money selling objects. It's like, we know too many people who had that dream, went through it, and can't pay their debt back, right? So I think a lot of us are like tapping into that, like where that there's something wrong with that. And what I was hearing from everyone was that there are all these alternatives. There are all these different, definitions of success, different ways of going about the art world, different communities that we can be tapping into. And something that we're all assuming going into this conversation is that we can't pay back the debt, that artists won't be able to pay back the debt of grad school or of different forms of education. And why is that? Like, that's what I'm wondering right now. Because if we valued artists a little differently, if we valued their time and their contribution to community, maybe they could pay back that debt, right? Or maybe they could pay back the money from the education. So that's a little bit off topic, but I'm curious if anyone's thinking about that too. And if any of you guys, I know Dexter and I talk about this all the time, but working on sort of changing that narrative and working on the actual value. I know there's been a lot of community organizing. I saw some questions in the chat about adjunct professors getting paid and the value of work in this situation, and the value of work in the MFA programs and the people teaching. So does anyone want to sort of jump off that? Okay.
May I start? Is that
Yes.
okay? One thing I would say, I think, Heather, I think you bring up a really good point, and I hope I'm not too boring in all of my answers, but I'm gonna just try to map something out. A program is such a finite number of elements. Even if those elements seem to be sprawling, they're really finite. A number of students will enter a facility. That facility will give them space. That would make it a studio program in almost all situations. So the MFA, which we don't ever want to talk about, is a studio art graduate program. It's a program in which what we're trading for your time is you put into a space, a studio of your own. What will happen to you in that space is a series of discussions and dialogues that will be also adorned with courses, right? So as much as we think about this, if those faculty members don't think outside of the gallery system, the program won't think outside of the gallery system. If the traffic that comes into your studio is only based in visual art study, then you will be feeling uncomfortable if you start to write, if you start to produce, if you start to work in areas or ways that are outside of studio production. So I think one starting point is, if you are a contemporary MFA program, what are you about? What is wrong with what you have now? How much are you not offering students by how little your faculty can cover, or the people who come through your program can offer your students? To earlier things with Paddy, do you teach writing courses, and do you have qualified writers who write about art coming in teaching you writing? Is that a valuable thing in your program, in the program that you're creating, whatever program that is? So I think that there are a lot of kind of structural questions that need to be asked that say, why aren't MFA programs more different one to the next? Why don't they have a better idea of what they are and aren't one to the next? If a program is going to be focused on painting and that's what it wants to do, it's going to have to figure that out and then fund the painters that want to study with it. If it's an interdisciplinary program in a very true sense, then that should not be multimedia as if we're in 1995. It should be an interdisciplinary program, and it should value the views and the ideas of myriad voices coming into that program, not just the students, but who the students engage with. And I think that all of these things have to be thought through far more thoroughly. And just as a last point to what Nato was mapping, I don't mean to elevate my program, But if you look at the 18 students, you will see a global community of students in the program. They are outfacing. What they're doing is outfacing. What their research is about is outfacing. And that hopefully is an understanding of what's going on inside of the program. If a program seals its doors and pulls the shades, ask why. Why are you doing that? Why can't you talk about what your students do? Are they happy? Are they productive? Do they get funding while they're there? So I think all of those things, again, are part of the scrutiny that's legitimate for a terminal degree.
Thanks, Charlie. And I just wanted to take this opportunity because my dear friend and instructor and my old boss from 20 years ago joined us at the crack of dawn in Thailand, Grititya Gawiwang. And I just want to say too, to your point, we do not, the Alternative Art School does not consider itself at war with MFA programs. We do think of ourselves as looking for allies. It is amazing that Jeb taught last quarter a class with us from Bangkok. We have 4 students who are taking classes from Thailand. And I wanted Jeb to just have an opportunity to talk about the experience and also the relationships that we have found in terms of producing an alternative global community of the arts.
Thank you so much for your conversation. You know what, it was really interesting to listen to this talk, from Thailand, because for me, I was thinking, wow, this is really US oriented kind of problems, because for my generation, I went to the grad school. That's why, we know each other at the Art Institute. And it's luckily that I finished it before the economic crisis. And my father said that you were so lucky because if I was in the school after 1997, I could not afford it. And before I went to the grad school, my father asked me, what are you going to do after you graduate? I said, I want to be a curator. I want to work in a museum in Thailand. And my father said that there is no contemporary art museum in Thailand. And I answered him, there will be one. I will wait for that. And I've been waiting for almost 20 years, to get like the right contemporary art museum in Thailand. But I don't have to wait for that because I really interested in what Nato kind of argue about. Why do we have to kill MFA? We don't need to kill it, and we have to. I think I wanted to know the alternative model of the MFA program in the US. Why can't you have fully funded program like the one in Germany or in Scandinavia?
Can I add?
Yes, of course. It's about social structures. It's about policy problem, right? But for us, a lot of younger generation in Thailand, when they come to ask me, should I go to school at the Art Institute or should I go to school at Columbia? I said, it's very expensive. Maybe you have to think of alternative, like why do you have to go to Art Institute? Not everyone will get successful as Apichat Pongvirasetakul, who, did a filmmaker, MFA program in the 90s, the same as us, and he's the only one, right, from the region who can make it. But who can guarantee that we will all get successful like him, right? So I think it was really interesting. I think we really have to come to the heart of social problems policy and why if the art school is so expensive in the US compared to the other school in the other region, in the other continent. So and for your information, I don't think New York is that important anymore after the 90s, because I mean, I saw a lot of successful artists in my part of the world and the other part of the world who did not have the gallery in New York. And there's a lot more spaces for us to enter in. So I wanted to know, because I was reading this Q&A, and I think a lot of people wanted to know if you don't QMFA, what is the alternative?
Can I just say 2 things? One to Heather's point, and then one to your very good question about alternative, which I don't know if I can totally answer. I think Heather brought up a great point about being paid for labor, and that ultimately artists are asked favors. They're not paid adequately, both in adjunct land, both in maybe even tenured track land. I don't know what that costs. I don't know what that is, but and I think the only thing we can control is what we offer each other for payment. And I know that we pay our instructors more than I make at SVA because I value their time, and I would rather make less profit as a very tiny business than I would glean more profit at their disadvantage, number one. So we have to start setting the boundaries for payments as people that are change makers. So at the cost of whatever it takes, we need to be creative about that. So that's number one. We do not need to ask for free labor anymore from anyone. And then number two, I don't know of an alternative per se. I think Thomas brought up a great point about artists trying to get grassroots experiences for doing residencies all over the country, traveling all around the world. And you bring up a great point about the decentralization of the art world. It is not New York and Berlin anymore, or LA necessarily, and everyone knows that. The one thing I can say that I feel like Hillary and I are really proud of is that we do offer something that's literally as cheap as possible if you're not going to a state school. And also there's so many free MFA programs in the United States that need to be mentioned, like Rutgers, Ohio State. Hunter's incredibly inexpensive. I think Carnegie Mellon might be fully funded. So there's actually a lot of opportunities for artists not to go into debt. Maybe it's not Charlie, I'm so sorry. But just to bring in the idea that we don't need to talk about like the top 5 schools, Yale, RISD, whatever, it's fine. Those are great institutions, but there's so many great institutions that are free and fully funded. So we really need to shift the dialogue. You're not gonna get famous just because you went to this one top 3 school. That's fine, you might, and that's not even the goal. But there's fully funded programs. And then there's alternative art programs like the New York City Crit Club, which is not a replacement, but maybe we don't need to go to school. Maybe it's not necessary for everyone.
Detour, could you talk a little bit about like the community that you really built? Because I feel like one of the things that sort of comes up about in the dialogue around like what you get from taking an MFA is like the network that you gain from it, no matter where you are. And like what these online networks can offer. And like, I guess one of the questions I had is like, maybe, I don't know if you can answer this, but also like how stable those networks are, because one of the things that I feel like comes up with the online networks is that if you don't kind of like, you don't own the platforms that you're operating on. So like it can be difficult to kind of like keep the things you build if like small changes are made.
Yeah, there's a ton of thoughts I want to hit on, and one was Heather's question about funding and everything, and I think Charlie hit on you got the military funding the some of these schools, and where is that for the arts? And I think we always talk about the MFA, but why is it surprising that they don't fund the MFA when we can go back to high school and middle school and elementary, and those are the first programs that get cut whenever there's sort of cuts to be had. So, going back and like trying to figure out how do we sort of provide as much art programming and to the students when they're sort of just being molded, I think is where we can sort of start and sort of show kids exactly, hey, you don't have to, you can use your creativity to make an impact in the world, because that's what we want to do as artists, is to just make an impact with whatever we're creating. And you don't need an MFA for that at all. You don't need any other sort of program. It's like, they'll teach you the techniques and skills. It's like, but you have to live life and learn and gain experience to really have an impact in the world, or figure out how to have that impact in the world. And that's what I've been doing, especially through community. And I think that's what you really wanted me to talk about too, is that, going at it, trying to figure out how to make that impact in the world with whatever I create. I had to sort of figure out how to build that community. And that's one thing that a lot of artists coming from these institutions really talk about is, how do they sort of come together to do peer reviews, talk to each other, sort of build off of each other, collaborate, innovate together, build off synergy. And that's something that I've been doing a lot of, is building through community, through, building the community through bringing everyone together by sharing as much as I sort of take. So giving as much as I take. I spend online as much as possible too, because then I can not only reach people and build community within my own sort of Denver area where I am, where I do a lot of street art, but also beyond the borders of, you know, my city, my state, my county, my country and continent. So really, you know, I've been doing that digitally through different digital platforms like Instagram and Facebook and things like that, but they are unstable, like you say. And for me, it's been really instrumental, or it's been a, I'd say, really focused on making sure that I build these platforms that are sort of not tied to one sort of medium, or build these communities that are not sort tied to one sort of platform, where it's sort of I'm able to go from place to place to place to place, because not everyone will be on the same platform in every country. Not everyone will be on the same platform and want to consume a community in the same way. So for me, there's been alternative ways of sort of building that community through these digital places, but also you have to have that real sort of in-person touch as well. So that also making sure that I travel. And that's been really sort of important in terms of my growth as an artist, is making sure I do these residencies, travel to some of these different countries, build with a lot of these communities outside of my local community as much as possible, because that has been something that has helped me grow from just being able to experience someone in their own sort of space. I'm able to I have to break out aside of my comfort zone and sort of figure out how do I adapt in sort of creating and sort of gaining inspiration in a whole new world that I may not know the language, I may not know the food, but it's kind of like, that's how you sort of grow as an artist. And that's sort of like what we want. And that's sort of like what I've been doing as an artist, trying to build that community and grow as an artist, and, you know, just do it outside of the more institutional way. Because for me, it's like, I can figure out how to make that impact in my community through my arts without having to go through, you know, I think Nato was talking about the art world, you know, what is that? So for me, it's been a lot of just trying to figure things out. And, you know, I don't have all the answers. I don't have all the magic sauce, but it's kind of like I'm going out there and figuring out, how do I sort of connect with these different communities on digitally and in person as I travel, and just figure out as I go along? Because I think sometimes we think there's supposed to be an answer, and a lot of times there's not. A lot of times you just have to feel your way through this foggy sort of cloud and stumble on sort of that area that you want to be in, or that sort of way of making that impact that you want to have. And, you know, it's definitely something I think artists, if you're thinking about that, just do it. That's the one thing. Like I moved to Tanzania without knowing anyone, off of a whim, a month after tearing my knee. And that sort of changed my life forever in terms of how I make an impact in the world and how I create and how I get inspiration. So for me, it's a lot of, you know, figuring it out as you go along. Hopefully that kind of answered the question. I kind of blabbed on for a little bit.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Nato actually has said he has to go. So we're going to have to wrap this up. Thomas, there was a question from the audience as to whether not having an MFA impacted your career in any way. Has it?
No, I mean, if it did, I didn't know. Like, I'm able to sort of like go into any space and talk to anyone that I want to, because I know a lot of this is really just about relationship building and connecting with people and seeing them face to face, and being able to sort of communicate how you want to make an impact in the world with your art and creation. And if it matches what they're sort of about, if it's at that intersection, you know, they're always willing to have that conversation. Many of the people that I really love their art, it's like they're not even, you know, they didn't go through the MFA program. They're engineers, they're doctors, they're sort of like, you know, ex-military, but, you know, they had, you know, some sort of inkling to do photography, and they travel. So like trying to figure out how to pull these different things out of your background and lean forward with that in terms of your way of creating art. And that sort of will make you extremely different and unique in how you sort of present yourself to the world. And I think that's something that's super refreshing versus someone who goes through the regular route in terms of, you know, going to school and then going to the BFA, then MFA, and figuring out how to get into a gallery. You know, for me, it's really refreshing seeing someone who just comes from the street, does artwork, and figures out how to, you know, get their artwork into on a large wall, or, you know, make a huge public project that, you know, is just different and out of the left field, because those are the projects that I really like, because it's more authentic to me in many ways. But for me, like not having an MFA wasn't a big problem, or didn't block me from any sort of opportunities that I know of. It's really just been a lot of, you know, elbow grease and hitting the pavement with, you know, creating these different projects, collaborating with people, doing the work in terms of traveling, in trying to figure out how do I sort of expand my experiences as much as possible. And that was, like I said, through the residencies that I've been going through meeting people, through just networking, through, you know, just exploring life and exploring different sort of mediums and you know, experimenting. But also you have to be fearless as well. It's like you have to be fearless. Like I said, you don't know exactly what's going to happen. You don't know exactly sometimes where you're going. Like I didn't know what I was doing going to Tanzania. I didn't have any money, but it's like I just took it on a whim and figured it out. And basically it was something that, like I said, changed my life and how I create and how I sort of, you know, want to sort of leave a stamp and sort of communicate, you know, my ideas and what I want to talk about. So you have to be fearless when it comes to sort of figuring out how you want to be the artist you want to be.
So Charlie, I believe you had a response that you wanted to, no response.
No, I do. Super quickly,
Okay.
just to add a quick dimension, we should maybe stop thinking of the notion of an MFA as something to have, because we talk about it as an object. And I think it's something that, and again, I'm not promoting it as a thing that is a requirement, but it's a thing to experience. And I think for everyone who's had an experience, and we've heard from the panelists about a positive experience, that, you know, comparing it to Thomas's life is an incredible linear experience. It also is an experience of someone who's strong and outgoing. I've spent years bringing in people into programs that are not as strong and outgoing, as an example. And the insularity of a program has helped them meet people. And maybe that parallels with residencies. I think that it really is going to depend on, a program should not be exploitative. It should not be unfair. But that doesn't make the program itself, or the notion of a program, a problem. I think that there are different models for different people, and some need to have community structured for them. I know I wouldn't have found myself on the West Coast if it wasn't for graduate school. And graduate school helped me acclimate to a very daunting city like Los Angeles in terms of its sprawl and complexity. So I feel sometimes it's just to move to a place or to leave a place. Sometimes it's to leave a conservative community to go to a more radical community. It's a piece of a puzzle. Sometimes it fits for people and sometimes it doesn't, but it is, if understood as an experience that acts as a kind of threshold that you go through for self-transformation, that to me makes much greater sense than getting a thing through that process. But Barbara Pollock, someone had mentioned a few times in the list, I will say concretely, academia requires an MFA for most cases to teach. And I think if people want to teach, that they'll realize that academia generates a degree to re-enter academia. Fair or unfair, that I think is a component. It's not all this, it's not required. I've worked with people who don't have MFAs, but for the most part, it is a requirement. And I think that's just something that also has to be considered, that it is something that can help you, even if you want to teach in a high school environment, having an MFA is helpful.
Thank you, Charlie. So I think it's probably time to wrap up. I wanted to ask the panelists whether anybody had any final comments or closing remarks they wanted to make before we move the discussion over to Clubhouse.
I just want to say thank you for organizing this for everyone. And I also think that it's really great to be in a position where we're just reevaluating things and discussing alternative models, partial, full-time, or whatever. And I do want to say one thing. I think one of my biggest pet peeves is when artists that I notice that I work with are struggling with the idea of how do I become a full-time artist as a goal to get to. And I think that's a problematic thing in terms of language, because art is a full-time thing, no matter if you have a part-time job. And all of us artists I know really work to some degree. So I just think that the way that we discuss art, everyone, is the way that we can change the rhetoric. The rhetoric then changes the mood, the temperament, and perhaps our decisions. But we don't have to talk about art as a full-time job or part-time job, and that diminishes people that work 3 jobs because of economic infrastructure. And it's not fair. And so I'll probably always work. Many of us will. And I just think the idea of art being like a full-time tenure as the goal is something we should stop enforcing. But I do think it's great if people don't have to do other jobs. Like, really, congratulations. I just don't think that we should think of that as the pinnacle. I go to openings and everyone's like, I'm full-time. And I'm like, you're full-time? Like, what does that mean? Explain to me the math. Or like, explain to me how you do it. And I think people should be just more frank about it and also stop saying that that's the goal, and that's just a general observation about the art world, similarly to the end goal of an MFA. Not the end goal, it's an experience, just an experience.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you as well for organizing this, because I think it was really great discussion, and particularly, Charlie, you're not boring at all. In fact, I think that it's actually quite exciting to hear someone talk about the inner workings of institutions, how they fund themselves, and what that looks like, because I think it's important for people to know that. There's so many complex financial decisions being made at these institutions and beyond. And I think for the students, it's important that they understand that and also think about that in the context of their own lives and their own decision making. And just lastly, there were a lot of comments in the chat that I was sort of like peering over at and looking at, where people are talking about being more or less rebuffed by gallery owners or curators because they don't have an MFA. I hear you, right? And I don't have an MFA, right? I hear you. I think that you have to, believe in what you're doing and understand that there is a path toward your goal that you're on. Having an MFA, not having an MFA, these are choices that are made by either your desire or your resources, but not having an MFA is not going to spell the end of your opportunities as an artist. So don't think that for a moment.
I just want to say how everyone's wrapping up is really interesting to me, because again, I'm going back to like, this is a systemic problem that goes well beyond the MFA. This is not a problem with the MFA. This starts when Thomas Detour said, the first thing to get defunded is the arts programs in public schools, which is exactly what happened during COVID. My kid lost like music and art and everything for months. Like that's the problem. It's the semantics that Catherine was just talking about, and it's not talking about the money, which is what Dexter was just talking about. I feel like if we all like change the language and advocate for new policy and be more transparent, like Charlie was just being, I feel like stuff can change that could actually, build upon the good parts of what the MFA is, because there are a lot of good parts.
Before I leave, thank you so much for inviting me. And I think we don't really touch upon the COVID situation, because I know a lot of artists who went to the MFA program in the US, and they have to come back to Asia to study online. And some of them felt that it's a lot of money, to pay on instead of on-site studio, in the US. So they kind of drop off that the program. And I think this is very important, because we have to rethink of how to invest, in our resource, right? Especially economy in this time of crisis. So if any one of you still thinking of attending MFA program while you're waiting or weighing your decision, the alternative art school might be your answer, for that. And I think we have to really like make use of this digital platform, in this time of crisis. So I just want to share this experience that you can create you still, you can find your own community, and you can still create your own place in the world, through this platform, even though it's reliable or not. For example, we are using Zoom at the moment, and I don't know how safety it is, at this point. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, and all the best, for everyone.
So in closing, we have a request from the audience to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down on the MFA, whether we should keep it. Where are we on this, panelists?
Well, I already gave my answer. I mean, to me, it's not even a question of whether you should kill it. I think it deserves to exist. There just are other issues that need to be addressed, in order for us to be able to move forward in a healthier way. And it's just plain as day to me.
I want to say thank you, and the last thing I want to say to a lot of the students that may be listening is, just define what success is for you in your life. Sometimes when we don't have that sort of concrete definition of what we want out of our lives, or what makes us happy, sometimes we sort of take other people's definition of success on and start to try to embody that. And sort of when we sort of go down that route and sort of achieve what we thought was successful, and we end up not being fulfilled, it's because we didn't really define what was success for us. And figuring out what that is, you have to sort of take a deep look at internally in yourself and figure out what makes you happy. What makes you happy in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? What can you go with? What can you go without? And I think that will really sort of help you make those decisions in life, and sort of figure out exactly what you want to do and how to do it. It's great to sort of look at other artists as sort of a template or an example, and also having a mentor. But really, it's really just ends up being all on you in terms of, what do you define as success, and what makes you happy, and figure out, how to sort of accomplish that through that.
I love that as a closing note.
Yeah, I just want to double down on Detour. I think you left us in an inspiring and hopeful space. I want to say thank you, of course, to Paddy, who moderated our discussion, and to all of the panelists, and Nato, who sadly had to leave as well. Thank you for this rich discussion. And I hope for all of our attendees listening that you do feel like you have kind of a broader sense of your own approach that will drive you to your own goals and own success, and the things that you can consider and have the right to consider in making that decision, versus a monofocal or limited definition of what the art world is. I also just want to agree with everybody on the importance of relationships, because I do think beyond degrees, beyond institutions and systematic oppression, relationships, I think, will bring us through many things, including the pandemic that we are all experiencing. So as much as I hate Zoom, I'm so glad to be connected with all of you tonight. And thank you so much. So we did want to invite people to continue the conversation on the Artist Lounge, which Detour is the primary admin for, and invited us to utilize this platform to continue the conversation. So for those of you who are familiar with Clubhouse and want to join, please join us. And with that said, have a lovely evening, and thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.